Hello again. Let's, can you hear me at the back, I hope? Yes? All well? Yeah, good. Ian Fleming. I became sort of interested in Ian Fleming, the man, having read James Bonds as a teenager. What drew me to be interested in Ian Fleming was the fact that Evelyn Waugh, another writer I sort of obsessed by, knew Fleming quite well, but they actually hated each other's guts, which I thought was quite interesting because I always saw them as rather similar types of English men or similar types of English writers in that they both wanted to die as soon as possible. They sound odd, but in Fleming and in Waugh there was a kind of death wish or a sort of self-loathing of wanting to leave this small planet as soon as possible. And yet, both men were in their own ways hugely successful. And Fleming, at the end of his life, was probably one of the best-known authors in the world. The Bond books were selling in their millions. The films were beginning. And yet his wife, Anne, wrote to Waugh once, Ian sits on his bed in his bedroom, looking out of the window in a state of utter despair. And I was curious about this particular death wish. And both men, interestingly enough, were massive drinkers and massive smokers. Fleming was an 80-a-day man. You have to be, you practically have to smoke one cigarette after another from getting up in the morning to going to bed at night to do that. And they also both abused what we call prescription drugs today. They took, Waugh, for example, was an insomniac. So he would take a huge draught of chloral, which was a very brutal and simple sleeping draught that knocked you out, made your breath smell appallingly, apparently. And then, of course, he'd wake up in the morning feeling terrible and have to take some amphetamines to get him going. And Waugh used to start drinking at 10:30 in the morning. He started off with a gin and orange squash, which must be one of the most revolting drinks one can imagine, and then just carried on all day, smoked cigars, not cigarettes like Fleming. Fleming was sort of 2 bottles of vodka a day. And sure enough, this sort of slow suicide that they were both embarked on began to take effect. Waugh was very close to Fleming's wife, Anne Fleming, and they had a nickname for him, Thunderbird, which was a bit unkind. And Waugh would write to Anne, "How's Thunderbird getting on?" And Anne would write back, say, "Oh, Thunderbird's in a terrible mood," or whatever. So they kind of joked about Fleming behind his back. And Waugh went to stay with them both once, and he wrote this to to Anne, or to Nancy Mitford. He said, it's quite a good quote actually, that's why I've written it down. He went to stay with Fleming in their hideously ugly country house, he said, and he said, "Ian looks and speaks as if he may drop dead any minute. His medical advisors confirm the apprehension." And sure enough, Fleming died in 1964, aged 56, and Waugh outlived him by a couple of years, and died in 66, aged 62. So both men got what they wanted, in a sense. They both ended their lives prematurely, but left this extraordinary legacy of the books they'd written. Fleming came to intrigue me so much that I actually put him in a novel. I put him in the novel Any Human Heart as Ian Fleming. And he recruits the fictional protagonist, Logan Mountstuart, into the Naval Intelligence Division in World War II when Fleming worked for the Naval Intelligence Division. There's another example of me putting fictional characters or fictional situations into real life events and real life organizations, and seeing what that brew produces. And I think it may have been because I had written about Fleming that one day my agent, Johnny Geller, rang me up and said, sat down, said, would you be interested in writing a James Bond novel? I said, yes, please. Or almost as quickly as that. And it was probably because of the Fleming Association initially. But another curious fact is that in my parallel career as a screenwriter and a part-time film director, I've actually worked with 3 of the actors who played James Bond. Sean Connery starred in the film of my first novel, A Good Man in Africa. I got to know him. Pierce Brosnan, before he was Bond, was in a little film I wrote called Mr. Johnson, which is really good, actually. And Pierce Brosnan is fabulous in it. And then the film I directed myself, which is I call it an art house war movie called The Trench, which is about 3 days before the Battle of the Somme in 1916, focusing on this group of young soldiers. I cast a certain Daniel Craig as the sergeant. And so there was this extraordinary coincidence of Fleming, Connery, Brosnan, Craig. I began to wonder if somebody was pulling some fatidic strings up above that had brought about this offer to write a Bond continuation novel, as they're known. And there have been a lot of continuation novels, in fact. Shortly after Fleming's death, Kingsley Amis wrote one called Colonel's Son, and then there were a couple of writers who wrote Bond novels. And then the Fleming estate, who control the kind of literary side of the Fleming legacy, decided to start asking more serious novelists, I suppose, to have a go at a Bond novel. And Sebastian Faulks did the first of this continuation series, and I ended up doing the third. And it was actually a great job, in a way, a great gift to be handed this mythic figure of James Bond and given almost total license to do what you wanted with him. There was no sense in which you had to set it in a certain time or place. The only real line in the sand was that you had to respect the traditions of the Bond canon. So if in my novel Bond had had both his legs amputated, that would not do. But, one understands that. Why take it on if you weren't going to respect the traditions of the canon? So you do, and you know there'll be at least 2 love affairs. There'll be a lot of stuff about cars. Being a non-driver, that was a bit of a challenge for me. And, food and drink, and a lot of drink. I've said that Fleming was a massive drinker, and what he did with Bond was to give Bond, he's not Fleming at all, but he gave Bond all the things he liked. And Fleming was very interested in women's fashion, for example. So you'll suddenly find Bond noticing that her silk gown was cut on the bias and things like that. Or Fleming was very particular about the type of marmalade he spread on his toast, or the cotton weave of his polo shirt. And all these things he gives to Bond. And he also gave to Bond his, I suppose unashamedly, you can only say his massive drink intake. There's a great line in one of the Bond novels which goes, Bond knew that the 13th double whiskey had been a mistake. And also Bond is a chain smoker like Fleming. He's always smoking. So what I decided to do, having got this wonderful job, I thought, well, I'm going to read the entire Bond canon, all the novels, all the short stories in chronological order, and take notes. So I duly did this. And as I read them very carefully, I began to notice things that were unusual. And, for example, Bond isn't English. He's half Scottish, half Swiss, which is quite intriguing. And Fleming, in the later novels in particular, makes great play of Bond's Scottishness. And of course, Flemings were a sort of ancient Scottish family, anglicised. But in the last novel, Bond is offered a knighthood. M rings him up and says, you know, you can have a K if you want it. And Bond says, not for me. He says, I'm just a Scottish peasant. And I find that very interesting. I wonder if it's because by that time Connery had been cast as Bond. But it's there in other novels as well. It's something that Fleming stressed. Also, I discovered that about 4 or 5 references to Bond being in combat in World War II, which is quite intriguing. Once at the Battle of the Bulge. So the very young Bond must have been a soldier in World War II. So I started putting all these odd facts into my novel. In my novel, Solo, there's actually a recipe for vinaigrette salad dressing. Not the sort of thing you'd expect to find in the James Bond novel, except Fleming had put a recipe for scrambled eggs in one of his James Bond short stories. And the thing that eventually began to dawn on me more and more as I read on, and I began to feel like the anxious wife of a chronic alcoholic, because James was really drinking far too much. And I began to note what he drank in each novel. And there's a wonderful bit in From Russia with Love, which I think is probably my favorite Bond novel, because Bond is flying from London to Istanbul on a mission. And of course, in those days, it must be the late 1950s, I suppose, you couldn't fly direct. You had to fly to Rome, plane refueled. You flew to Athens, plane refueled, flew on to Istanbul. So Bond gets on the plane, London, flies to Rome. He has 2 large Americanos at Rome airport. Gets on the plane again, flies to Athens. He has 2 large Uzos at Athens airport. And on the final leg of the journey from Athens to Istanbul, he has a dry martini and half a bottle of claret. So you think, well, did he fall down the steps of there before he went off to save the world? Anyway, it was a great pleasure writing the book, and I took it extremely seriously, as you can probably tell. And the interesting thing is that because I'd done this research and read the novel so thoroughly, I think I actually knew more about Bond than the Flemings did. For example, Bond was a very nervous flyer. He hated turbulence. Now you sort of think, 007. But it's there in the novels. Fleming put it down. And so when there was ever a query from the estate about something I'd put in, I could quote chapter and verse at them. And so it was very amicable. You were given, this incredible freedom to write what you want. And I took Bond, set the novel in 1969 when he was 45 years old, a middle-aged spy. I sent him to Africa, a country that no Bond novel has really taken place in, apart from the very end of Diamonds Are Forever. See how boring I can be about it. And put him down in the African bush with no gadgets, no weapons, and really gave him, I thought, a different kind of experience. And also the other thing I did, which Fleming didn't do, I wrote the entire novel from Bond's point of view. So everything is seen through his eyes. You have access to his thoughts, his feelings, and his reactions. And so I felt, one of the things I said at the beginning, I wanted to create a portrait, an intimate portrait of this mythic, fictional figure based on all the information that Fleming had given us in his novels. And that somehow at the end of Solo, you would have a real sense of who Bond was. Bond was an avid reader. Did you know that? His flat in Chelsea was lined with books. All this evidence is in. He quotes Milton. He quotes all sorts of poets. Very, very interesting, complex figure. But as I say, everything that Fleming liked, he kind of gave to Bond. And the only time we had a sort of contretemps with, or I had a contretemps with the Fleming estate, was over the issue of M. Because I had this theory, having read through the novels, and I knew that M was based on somebody Fleming had worked with at the Admiralty, who was sacked in the war, in fact. But Fleming really admired him. And I always thought there was a kind of father-son relationship between Bond and M. And the Fleming estate disputed this, and they said, no, that's not right. Well, it was a hunch, and I couldn't for once quote chapter and verse, so I didn't push that too far. But I'll give you read you a little bit of the Bond, where I try to pin down the Bond-M relationship. And I think I'm right, but see what you think. Bond goes out to Africa, right, and he gets very badly shot there. He then has to recuperate in a military hospital near Edinburgh, and M comes to visit him in the hospital, much to Bond's surprise, and brings him half a bottle of whiskey. Anyway, they have a chat, and here's the bit that I wrote, which is about as close as I could get to my theory. M stood up and put down his glass, searched his pockets absent-mindedly, and then lifted his hat and coat off the hook on the back of the door. Call when you get back from your holiday, M said. Go somewhere nice and relax. You've had a hell of a time, and you're lucky to be alive. Get yourself really fit and well. Be self-indulgent. He patted Bond's shoulder. Bond stood, and they shook hands again as they parted. There was a tiny but palpable current of mutual feeling in the room, Bond thought, of barely discernible emotion. For all Bond knew, M only possessed a superior's affectionate regard for him, the respect due to a trusted and prized operative who'd done a good job and had put his life on the line. But on his side, Bond wanted to show that he was genuinely grateful for this unexpected informal visit all the same, that it marked something out of the ordinary, out of the line of mere duty somehow. But he couldn't think of anything to say without making a fool of himself or embarrassing M. Thanks for the whiskey, sir, was all he could manage in the end. It should be, thanks for the whiskey, sir. Anyway, that was my Bond adventure, one of my fictions, and I'm very proud of my Bond novel, and it sits on the shelf with the others, and was a fascinating exercise. But I tackled it in the same way as I tackle all my novels, this idea of trying to make the world that Bond was in and the person he was and the people he encountered as real as possible. So I was given this mythic figure and put him in a realistic novel. Now we're going to turn to the other individual on this adventure, Mr. David Bowie, late lamented David Bowie, because I invented a character, and he was very intimately involved in that character's fictional life. And it's a curious combination that I should have got to know him a bit in the 1990s. But it came about because I write a lot about art, and I'd written a couple of articles for this very sort of highbrow art magazine, quarterly, glossy art magazine called Modern Painters. And I was asked to join the editorial board of Modern Painters, and I felt very flattered and honored to do it, and I went along to the first editorial board dinner in a private room with various professors of art history and art critics and so on. And who should I find myself sitting beside but him, David Bowie. And he, at the same time, had been asked to join the editorial board as well. And because Bowie was fascinated by art and been to art school, I think for him it was a kind of escape from being David Bowie rock icon. And he entered a world where he was on his mettle, just as I was on my mettle. I'm not an expert, just an enthusiast. And he was more David Jones than David Bowie in that room. And I'm convinced that some of the elderly professors present had no idea who that thin, blonde man was sitting at the end of the table. Anyway, we were the two new boys on the editorial board, both of us slightly ill at ease amongst all these sort of grand experts. And so we forged a kind of relationship and all sat beside each other. And, as much as you can get to know somebody like that a little bit, I got to know him a little bit. And then one day the editor of the magazine said, how on earth do I get fiction into a serious art magazine? And I stuck up my hand and said, why don't I invent a painter? And she said, great idea. So I went away and I thought about this, and I invented a painter who I called Nat Tate, an American painter, born in 1928, died in 1960, committed suicide, jumped off the Staten Island ferry, body never found. But before he died, Nat Tate had managed to round up 99% of his work and had burned it. And that's why none of you have ever heard of it. Anyway, so I invented a life of Nat Tate. That's him. That's the only known picture of Nat Tate, by the way. Taken in London in the late 1950s. Handsome fellow. And having invented his life, and in order to make him, again, think of my credo, in order to make him as real as possible, I wrote a sort of long essay about his short life. But what I did to make it seem more plausible was find photographs, anonymous photographs, which I then captioned. Nothing like a caption on a photograph, I can tell you, of his stepfather, his gallerist, his studio, etc., etc. And then I asked two friends to remember Nat Tate. One of them was Gore Vidal, the eminent American novelist who I knew. And I said, Gore, would you remember meeting Nat Tate? And just give me your impressions. And of course, being a good sport, he did. He said, Nat was a good-looking boy, but he drank too much. He had an affair with Peggy Guggenheim. I said, that's enough. Stop there. That's all I need. He gave me a quote for the cover. And then I went to talk to another friend of mine, John Richardson, who's a very eminent art critic and is writing the biography of Picasso. He's written three volumes so far. He's got one more to go. But John actually knew Picasso, and he knew Georges Braque. And so I said to John, would you remember a dinner party where you introduced Nat Tate to Picasso at your house in Avignon in 1959? He said, yes, of course. And then, could you give him a letter of introduction to Georges Braque so that Nat Tate can visit Georges Braque's studio in Normandy? Perfect. So he did all that. And so I had, the last thing I had to do, because Nat Tate had destroyed so much of his work, only a few drawings remained. And luckily enough, I managed to lay my hands on 4 of them, which I did. And they were reproduced in this big article. So there we were in Modern Painters with all this stuff, photographs, Gore Vidal, John Richardson, actual art created by Nat Tate. And then David Bowie said, why don't we publish it as a little book, a little coffee table book? He had his own publishing company called 21 Publishing. And he said, we could make a lovely little book out of this. I said, great idea, David. Let's do it. So we did do it. And here is the first edition of Nat Tate, a beautiful little monograph full of illustrations. Nat Tate, an American artist, 1928 to 1960. And then Bowie said, and this may have been something to do with his publishing company, he said, let's launch this book at a big party in Manhattan. That's Bowie, and that's Jeff Koons. Now, they were friends, and Jeff Koons, hugely successful kind of pop artist, I suppose you'd describe him, had an enormous studio in Manhattan. Bowie said, can I use your studio for a launch party for this book? And Jeff Koons said, sure. And the invitations went out. Who wouldn't go to a party in Jeff Koons' studio hosted by David Bowie? Everybody was there. It's now one of these mythic parties, like Truman Capote's Black and White. Brad Pitt was there. There were quite a few artists and quite a few New York glitterati and intellectuals. And so they had this big party took place. And what Bowie did, was to read from the book. There's Nat on the edge there. Read from the book, deadpan. And one of the things that he'd done was to write the blurb of the book, being its publisher. I mean, how cool is that? David Bowie writes the blurb to your book, and he was very, very clever about it. And this is what he wrote about Nat Tate. January the 8th, it seems, is not only my birthday, but also the fateful day when the painter Nat Tate contrived to round up and burn almost his entire output. 4 days later, he jumped to his death from the Staten Island ferry, thereby completing the ragged circle of his life's events. William Boyd's description of Tate's working procedure is so vivid that it convinces me that the small oil I picked up on Prince Street, New York, in the late 1960s must indeed be one of the lost third-panel triptychs. The great sadness of this quiet and moving monograph is that the artist's most profound dread, that God will make you an artist, but only a mediocre artist, did not, in retrospect, apply to Nat Tate, David Bowie. Anyway, so he read extracts from the book to the assembled crowd. There's another picture, I think, there he is. There's Nat Tate. There's Jeff Koons behind him, looking slightly less happy, I think. I don't know if he suspected something was afoot, because this was a conspiracy, and there were only about 5 or 6 people who knew that the whole thing was a figment of my imagination. But, as conspirators will do, careless talk costs lives, 2 of them were overheard discussing the hoax by the art critic of The Independent. And his condition for remaining silent was that he had to be brought into the circle of conspirators. What could we do? We said, yes, of course. But being a man with a nose for a good story at this incredible party in Manhattan with Jeff Koons and Julian Schnabel and Brad Pitt and all these people, he went around the room asking people questions about Nat Tate. And after Bowie's reading, he said, have you ever heard of Nat Tate? And people being people said, why, yes, of course. And what a tragedy that he died so young. And I remember that show in Pittsburgh. And dug a hole for themselves and duly jumped in. I actually wasn't at this party. I was on a book tour, and but before I'd gone on my book tour, I'd given a lot of interviews to the British press, because this big party in Manhattan was to be followed a week later by an equally big party in London, where exactly the same thing would ensue, where Bowie would read out passages of the book and we'd see what happened. My feeling was that it should be just a slow burn, that people would read this account of a life and think, this is a load of rubbish, and then turn the page and see that Gore Vidal said he was a good-looking boy, but he drank too much. And you think, well, if Gore Vidal, remember, this is pre-Google. You couldn't do it now, but it's pre the age of Google. And I wanted people to challenge me, and I'd rebut them and so on. But the journalist realized that he had a story here, and he blew the hoax wide open 4 days later. On the front page of The Independent, it said, British novelist fools Manhattan art world. Well, had I? I don't think so. few people had, done the things that people do and say, yes, I've heard of somebody when that person didn't exist. But what it proved to me is that everybody loves a hoax, and particularly if you're hoaxing self-important, pretentious people, it's even more delightful. And the thing just blew up. It was a 24-hour media event. I was interviewed by Jeremy Paxman on Newsnight for 20 minutes. It was ridiculous. And all the Brits were saying, well, I knew it wasn't true. Those drawings are appalling. And leaving the egg on the face of their American cousins, as it were. But in fact, they had been hoodwinked, and two very eminent journalists had interviewed me and bought the story wholesale. I was lying to them, of course. But anyway, so that was a hoax over news event, but it wouldn't go away. People love hoaxes, and the book was translated into French, and then into Spanish, and then into German. We did 2 television documentaries about Nat Tate. And this actually is 20 years ago now, because the Jeff Koons party happened on the 1st of April, 1998. Get it? And it was all beginning to get a bit out of hand. I was feeling like Dr. Frankenstein with his monster. This little fairy tale. It was a kind of comment on Nat Tate wasn't a very good artist. And then he met a genius, Georges Braque, and he realized how crap he was and decided to kill himself. That was the kind of story behind the. But because the hoax had gone on, and of course because of Bowie's role in it, it just became bigger and bigger. And I went to the German publication of Nat Tate. I was interviewed on television. There was a big gathering in a very trendy art gallery in Berlin, 300 people. I was interviewed on stage by the editor of an art magazine about Kunst und Fiktion. And behind me was this enormous, 3 times the size of this, picture of Nat Tate over my shoulder. And I thought, this is getting totally out of hand. I have to do something about it, drive a stake through his heart or something like that. So I thought, what on earth can I do? What options are available for me as the creator of this monster to try and bring about some kind of closure? And so I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll do another Nat Tate drawing, and we'll sell it at auction at Sotheby's or Christie's. Fake artist, fake art, real money. That should somehow bring about closure, I thought. So I had friends at Sotheby's, and they were good sports as well, and they said, yes, let's do it. So I did this little drawing. It's about the size of a postcard. There it is. Nat Tate liked drawing bridges for some reason. And he did a whole series of drawings of bridges. And this, you could probably see, is bridge number 114. There are about 160 bridges in all. Most of them lost, burned by Nat. But anyway, here was a Nat Tate signed with his distinctive signature. And those dark blobs are actually his fingerprints. This is as close as we'll ever come to the real person. So I did this drawing. I framed it beautifully in a museum mount, white frame, so it's quite a large painting. 2 pages in Sotheby's catalogue, provenance, little essay by me. Everybody knew I did the Nat Tates by this time. But we kept up the pretense. And Sotheby's put an estimate of £3,000 on this little drawing. And I thought, great, fantastic. So the day of the auction came round. Very exciting to be in the room. And lot number 163 or whatever it was came up. Pen and ink drawing by Nat Tate, bridge number 114, and the bidding started. And it was quite fierce, actually. £3,000, 3,500, 4,000, 4,000. And eventually, it actually got to £7,500. And I was thinking, old age pension, just I just need to churn out the odd Nat Tate. But I should say that actually the money was not going to me; it was going to a charity for impoverished artists. Anyway, it was sold for £7,500 to an anonymous bidder on the telephone. Bang. I said to the Sotheby's people, who was it? Who bought it? I said, there aren't many Nat Tates out there in the world. I need to know who's got this one. And they said, well, we can't tell you. So, that's the anonymous, rules of auction houses. If the bidder doesn't want to be known, we can't let you know who he or she is. So I persisted, and then they asked the bidder and said, could we reveal your identity? And the person said, yes, you can. And so Sotheby's people called me and said, who bought it? I said, it's somebody called Anthony McPartlin, who of course is Ant of Ant and Dec fame. And I thought, well, Ant is an anagram of Nat. It couldn't be, in a way, it couldn't be better. But of course, it was a disaster for me, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, because it just, gave new blood to my monster. And the closure that I had been seeking never actually emerged. And 20 years on, Nat Tate rumbles on. Bowie's death, of course, sparked new interest in that side of his life. When he auctioned his art collection was auctioned and so on, I found myself writing articles about Nat Tate and David Bowie, and I realized that actually it's doomed. I'll never get this monkey off my back. He's there for good. But in a way, it's a sort of tribute, I suppose, to the power of fiction, and tribute, in a way, to this strange credo that I have, which I'll read to you again, which I think is proved valid in the case of all the books I've been talking about and all my work. And it's certainly the sort of driving impetus behind Love is Blind, or the key factor in fiction, to make your readers believe in the truth of your story. They must believe that what they are reading actually happened. Any means to this end is acceptable as long as it works. But sometimes it can work too well. That's the problem. And I'm stuck with Nat Tate, but hey, there are worse things that can happen to you. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for coming along tonight. Hope you've enjoyed yourself. Thank you.